are going to be visiting with Peter Lavelle and Sarah Miller on creating a serious game about organizational agility. Peter is the serious games and experimentation lead for, is it MITRE or Mitra?
MITRE.
Okay, good. So MITRE's User Experience, Visualization, and Decision Support Department. The MITRE Corporation is a not-for-profit organization that operates research and development centers for the federal government. Peter has 20 years of experience designing and developing both digital and tabletop serious games in support of research and education for a wide variety of government agencies. Peter also teaches a class on designing serious games for behavioral research at the MITRE Institute. Peter received his MS from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Presenting with Peter is Sarah Miller, and she's an organizational development lead at the MITRE Corporation. She specializes in organizational leadership, team development, and culture change, and has worked across a variety of sectors in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the US. Sarah received a certificate in organizational development from Columbia Universities and holds several certifications in leadership and team development tools. She received her MA from University of Michigan and her BA from UNC Chapel Hill. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Peter and Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so Sarah, I think you're going to kick us off.
Yeah, I like that applause at the end. Thank you. So you already talked a little bit about MITRE, so I don't have to talk as much. But the one thing we wanted to share with everyone is the game that we're going to talk about and the organizational agility research that the game is based on. We were able to do this because MITRE operates a research stream of work. And so our customers, our sponsors, different government agencies will come to us with big challenges that they're facing, and we can use some of that research funding to figure out creative solutions. And so that's really where this work sprang from. So next slide, Peter. So quick agenda for our time together. We're going to spend a little bit of time going over organizational agility and what that means based on the research that we've done. We started the research back in 2016. And we're going to talk most of the time around how do we make this serious game, and that'll be Peter leading that. And we'll share some of the lessons learned, both from kind of the team development side and then also from the game making side. And then we'll hopefully have some time to show you some cool pictures of our game and answer any questions that you have. So the reason that we got started in this research on organizational agility is because our sponsors were coming to us with questions about how they could work in new ways. And this is primarily because all of the organizations that we're a part of, we've inherited a lot of patterns, practices, ways of behaving that worked in the past for those organizations, but they don't work as well today because organizations in the past existed in a more stable, maybe more certain environment. And there are a lot of things that went on that made sense for those conditions, like being more stovepiped, being more authority-based, maybe being more hierarchical. But those things don't work as well in today's environment. We have some pictures on this slide of the Ford assembly line. One of my favorite quotes was when Ford said, you know, you can have your Model T in any color you want as long as it's black. And that attitude just doesn't really work anymore. And so these were some of the dynamics that we were trying to help people move away from in the game that we're going to get into. So next slide. So the way that we are looking at organizational agility, there's a fair amount of literature out there now on this, but it's still, I think, kind of an emerging concept, is it's an organization's capacity or ability to sense what's going on in its environment. And so you can see in this framework over on the left-hand side, in the environment, there's a lot of dots swirling around. That's really to represent, you know, all the different information and trends and events that might be happening in an organization's environment. So how does the organization sense that, bring it inside, make sense of it, and then respond in a timely and effective way? And timely is really key here. A lot of times when we hear the word agility, we think it must mean fast. And that's not always true. What we really want is a response that makes sense, both for time and the solution that's going to work in this changing and uncertain environment. So those are the routines, and then the dimensions that the routines really rest on, and this is what we tried to bring out in the game, are how is the organization structured, how are we sharing knowledge, where are decisions getting made, what is the leader doing to promote things like psychological safety, and how are we managing processes and roles, and what norms do we have. And hopefully the idea is if we set those up in an agile way, we'll get the outcomes we're looking for. So this next slide just describes a little bit more about the different dimensions that I just talked about. But the main thing that we wanted to highlight here is agility is really about the balance between stability and flexibility. And this has been one of the concepts I think that, the people we work with have struggled with a fair amount. And one of the reasons we wanted to create the game. So in the game, we're really looking at that dynamic. How do we balance the things that need to be consistent and predictable with the things that don't really need that kind of rigor? They need to be more flexible, more emergent, more creative. And how do we allow for that? So next slide. So why a tabletop game? So like the intro said, I work in organization development. So we designed, this framework. We designed an assessment that went along with it. We were working with our sponsors. They would take the assessment. We'd give them this report. It was really interesting information. But when it came to action, it was hard sometimes because a lot of the concepts in agility are scary. It's kind of a mindset shift. It's a different way of working than we've learned how to do for years and years and years. And so we wanted to create a safe space for people to learn and experiment with these new ideas. So really looking at that applied learning space. How do we let them apply the new skills and new techniques without any risk involved? We wanted to create a place where they could interact. So, we're working a lot of times with senior leadership teams, and having a tabletop game really provides for team development in addition to learning about the concept of organizational agility. So they can practice things like collaboration and trust building while they're also talking about them. Having a tabletop game allows us as facilitators to observe the dynamics at play and then really tailor the debrief of the principles to what's going on in the group. And then finally, that safe place to learn gives people more confidence in being able to apply and transfer knowledge once they get back into their organizations. So Pete, I will kick it to you.
Okay, here we go. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time walking you through a very high-level view of the process that we go through when we're trying to develop a serious game at MITRE. What the game that you're seeing right here, this is actually the Mars Agency game. This is a beta version, so everything's printed on paper at this point in time. The Mars Agency was basically an organizational simulation for 5 to 7 players. Each player is playing the role of an agency leader, so that whether that's a director or a deputy of hydration or medical deputy, they're all playing kind of mid-level leader roles in this organization. This larger level organization of Space Command. And the goal for them is to prepare Mars for another larger wave of workers. So they're kind of like the first force that's on Mars. They're trying to prepare the facilities so that more people can come up onto Mars. And mechanically, the way that they're doing that is by creating biodomes and keeping the workforce alive while they're doing it. Okay, so the first thing that we address when we're going to make a serious game is purpose. Every game has to be fun, right? So it's still important that the game is fun, otherwise it's not a game. But for a serious game, the most important thing is really the purpose. If you're not achieving your purpose, then you've really failed in the serious game. And so defining purpose is really important, and it can be a challenge. So quite often you're going to be working closely with those stakeholders, going back and forth a little bit to really understand what is it they're trying to achieve, and then that's going to be your purpose. And you want purpose to be like a one sentence, very precise and to the point. This is what we're trying to achieve. So for the Mars Agency game, our purpose was to teach agency leaders about organizational agility. So that's our purpose. Now, how do we actually achieve this purpose, right? And so that's when we start getting into scope. And so again, it's very important to be careful about how you define your scope. It's just as important to call out what you're not doing as what you are doing. So when we're going through a scope, we want to basically support our purpose with the scope that we've defined. For an educational game like the Mars Agency, part of the scope is going to be the learning objectives. So right up front, we want to talk about what are the learning objectives, what is it that we want them to take away after they've played this game. And again, it's really important to try to get that scope as small as possible, because the larger the scope is, the longer it's going to take to play the game, the more information you're going to be throwing at people, and the less likely it is that you'll actually be successful in having them learn the things that you really want them to learn. So the first thing you really need to do when you start to develop a serious game, after you've defined your purpose and scope, is to understand the system that you're working with. So to me, designing and developing a serious game is a systems engineering challenge. This is one of the reasons why we do them at MITRE, because we are a systems engineering organization. And so you need to understand the system that you're working with. I'm a user-centric design and development person, so I have a tendency to look at the actors first. Absolutely no reason that anyone has to start there, but that's where I like to start. I like to kind of look at who are all the actors in the system that we're working with. What's the relationship between those actors and the rest of the system? What are the kind of the frictions and influences they have on each other, and what are their motivations? What are they trying to achieve in this system that we're working with? And so this is just kind of an example, a high-level example of what an actor map might kind of look like. For the Mars Agency game, we were really identified that management team as our target audience, and so those are the primary actor. You can have multiple primary actors in a system. There's nothing wrong with that. In this game, we have one very specific primary actor, so that's nice. It makes things a little easier for us. We've also gone ahead and identified secondary actors. And so all those green actors that you see on the screen, those are folks that have meaningful interactions with the management team and influence the decisions that they're making on a day-to-day basis. And then we also go out to tertiary actors. And I'm only showing a couple examples here on the screen so that the screen doesn't blow up. But those are our pink actors there, general public and board. Those are representing tertiary actors. Those are the folks that are having an influence on the influencers that are influencing our primary actors. What I've done here is I've actually underlined the actors that we chose to represent in the game. One of the things that you might be questioning is why is there a tertiary actor representing in the game and many of the secondary actors are not? And so that's a teaser. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. Additionally, in defining the system, I mean, you need to look at every element of the system, but it's important to make sure that you're considering the environment. These are a bunch of the different environmental factors that we identified for the Mars Agency game, and remember, this is the environment that your target audience is currently working in. This isn't the environment for the game. We're going to try to identify as much as possible. So just like with the actors, we're just seeing as big a picture as possible, finding out as much information as possible, and then we're going to start whittling that down when we actually create a game. So for now, we go big, and then we're going to start going small shortly. I actually like to compare learning the system to method acting in some ways. So you really want to try to immerse yourself in the system as much as possible. It would be great if we could all go off and work for a year, whatever environment we're trying to model. That's usually not reasonable. When possible, we like to do site visits to see people in their actual environment. But quite often, what it comes down to is just having a lot of interviews with SMEs and our target audience, the people who are our target audience, just to try to see from multiple different perspectives what they feel like their environment is. What are the things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis? Okay, so now you're going to jump right into game design. For folks who are game designers, a lot of this is going to probably sound very, very familiar. I think that these are pretty typical steps that you take in game design. But for everyone else, just for your knowledge, game design is an iterative process. So I'm going to go through and show you kind of a number of steps that we take in game design, but we do these steps over and over and over again until we've refined a product to something that we feel is good. So the first thing to think about is that while gaming and modeling are both forms of simulations, they are different things. They're different beasts. And a game is not a model. More is not better. So when you've got a model and you've got a computer that's keeping track of all the variables in your model, it's perfectly fine for you to have 1,000 different variables because the computer can handle that no problem. But if you sit down a bunch of people around a table and you say, here's 1,000 different variables you have to keep track of, their brains are going to explode. We're just not as good at that as computers are. We're better at some things. We're not as good at just storing variables. So reduction is a really important part of game design. And this is, even if you're making a game for fun, reduction is an important part of game design. And really what it's all about is trying to identify what are the core elements of the systems, what are the levers and the choices that really matter, and what are the things that are going to help us in identifying our learning objectives and allow people to learn those learning objectives. And so kind of figuring out what is the core set of things is the whole point of reduction. So an example in the Mars Agency game, this is what, if you look on the left there at Yuri, that's what a worker looked like in the alpha version of the game. And so they had a face, they had a name, they had personalities and interests, and it was a very cool, very interesting kind of component, but it was kind of complex, right? And so this is a whole bunch of information for people to keep track of just for one worker, never mind the rest of the system that they're dealing with. And so you can see on the right here, by the time we got to beta, the workers had been reduced down to a meeple and an interest token. And so those were kind of the core elements that we identified. This is what we really need to have for a worker, to represent a worker, in order for us to talk about the learning objectives within the game. Additionally, you want to think about your resources, any of your basic resources components. You want to minimize that down to a representative set. In a lot of games, what that means is we reduce things down to money, right? And money represents everything else. This game, actually, we did not do that. We don't have money in the game at all. We're working with other resources because those were actually a better match for what we were trying to teach people in the game. Okay, now the next concept is abstraction. And this can be very confusing for a lot of people. I still get confused sometimes. What's the difference between reduction and abstraction? And so the way to think of it is reduction is all about the pieces we're cutting out. So we're removing elements from the game that we think are not critical to teaching, to whatever our purpose is for the game. Abstraction is a little bit different. So abstraction is more about simplifying. It's not necessarily removing things, but it's simplifying their representation or simplifying how they interact with the rest of the game. So as an example, and I gave you this teaser earlier, we used both abstraction and reduction with our actor set. So we had those secondary actors we didn't include in the game. For vendors, it's because we decided we actually don't really need them. They're not critical for what we're trying to teach people right now. So we reduced vendors. We eliminated that actor and said we don't need them in the game. For unions, families, customers, what we noticed is a lot of the interactions that they're having with our primary actor are similar. And so that's a good opportunity for abstraction, for basically saying, okay, well, instead of having 3 different things that have a similar kind of interaction, why don't we have one thing that represents that kind of interaction? And so we were able to do that by rolling them up into general public. And so that's the reason why general public was included, is because general public is really an abstraction of these other secondary characters. Something as simple as taking a very complex thing like getting somebody healthy and saying, okay, we're going to determine health by a roll of a die. That's an example of abstraction. We've taken a complicated concept. We haven't removed it from the game, but what we have done is abstracted it down to a very simple mechanic. And again, as I mentioned before, this is an iterative process that you're going to go through. So, sometimes you're going to go backwards. So during the game development, at one point we had abstracted down person hours to just a meeple. And so everything was just represented by a meeple. That meant a person's time. But as we kind of tested the game and looked at some of the learning objectives, what we realized is, okay, there is actually an important difference in that maker versus manager. And we can't just treat all people's time the same. And so we kind of rolled that back a little bit, and we separated out worker person hours from management time units. And we said, okay, so for the players, you're going to use your time in slightly a different way. And so we're going to actually use a different token to represent time. And there's a slightly different set of rules as to how you can use the management time units versus the worker time units. Okay, so we just showed you a few symbols. Symbolization is a pretty important part of any serious game. And this is something that can be overlooked easily, but symbolization really is important. You're asking, especially when you're trying to teach people something, right? Whether it's an educational game or a cultural change game, which the Mars Agency game is both of those. You want them to come away remembering the things that you're trying to teach them, the things that you want them to remember. And if they have to spend a lot of time doing mental gymnastics and being like that red cube meant like, money, the less intuitive your symbology in the game is, the more brain power they're going to have to spend on just trying to do those mental gymnastics, the less space they have for actually learning the things that you want to teach them. So as an example, in the Mars Agency game, this is what our biodomes look like. And so when you see something like this on the game board, I feel that it's very obvious that that's a biodome. You don't have to do a lot of mental gymnastics and try to think about what does that represent. Additionally, for other components that we create, we generally try to reprint that same symbology on all of the game pieces, right? So again, this is a player board. There's no question about where do I put my meeples, where do I put my time units, because the symbology is the same. So it's very easy to kind of do that mapping. They don't have to think about it. Another kind of concept that I wanted to talk about with symbology has to do with kind of the environment that you're setting up for them. Especially again with an educational game, you're asking people to kind of change the way that they're thinking sometimes, and this is more so even with cultural change games than with educational games. But we're asking people to change the way they're doing things, change the way they're thinking. They're going to have a lot of biases about how things work today. So if we held this game in the setting of an office in downtown New York, and their space looks very similar to what their current organization looks like, and the way things are looking is all similar, they're going to come in with very strong biases about this is how things are done today, this is how things have always been done, this is how things work. We're not ready to make that leap. If you can take them out of that environment, put them into another environment, which is maybe similar but different, then that allows them to remove some of those mental biases and blocks that they have. At the same time, you do need to be careful that it's not too different. If you go too far afield, then it may be difficult for them to make the mental mapping back, right? The lessons I learned in the game, how those apply to my real world situation. So there's a little bit of a balance there, but there's definitely benefits for taking them out of the environment that they're familiar with. I almost never make a game where I put them in the environment that they are currently in. Mechanics are basically just the rules of play for a game. It tells you how you can interact with other people, how you interact with the game pieces, like what can you do, and mechanics are generally what is primarily driving the dynamics of a game, and we'll get into dynamics in a second. So some examples of mechanics, just the fact that you're rolling a die, that's an example of a mechanic. In the Mars Agency game, we actually had hidden information. So both psychological safety as well as public opinion, we're tracked by the facilitator, but we're not made known to the players unless they took the right actions. So if they did the right sort of things in the game, they could get access to this information, and then it was then shared with them. So that's an example of a mechanic as well. We used two-sided cards in the game to represent our facilities, technologies, and policies. And so until they had actually built one of those things, whether it's a policy, facility, research, they basically, they can look at both sides of the card. So they can see, what am I going to gain if I build this? But the back side of the card, which is that grayed out side, just has information about how do you actually build this capability. And then once it's built, they flip that card over, and now they can just continue to see what the benefit of that building that capability was. we wanted to represent kind of the chaotic environment that you're going to be working with in an agile or in any organization, and probably just in life in general. And so we did that in two different ways. We had curveballs, which that civil dispute card on the far right, if you look at that, that's an example of a curveball. These were every turn they picked a curveball, and these are just kind of random events that happened. You couldn't really, you couldn't really predict that these things were going to happen, but they would happen, and you had to deal with them. But then we also had larger scale scenarios, and that's what that colonial burgeoning, the larger card in the back there is an example of one of those. And so these were large scale scenarios that had more impact on the game, and you could actually get some forewarning about them if you're doing the appropriate type of sensing. And so this again tied back to one of the learning objectives in the game. We really wanted them to understand the value of sensing and how that can help you be more proactive in your organizational responses. And so that is a mechanic that is built into the game. Lastly, we had a mechanic for creating teams. And so teams were created. You had to have multiple workers associated with the team. Each worker, there are different colors for the workers that represent different skills. So this is actually a medical worker that they were red. And so you assigned a worker and an interest and gave them a task. And so between the worker, the interest, and the task that they were working on, which could have been something such as sensing, that would define whether or not they were able to kind of unlock new technologies. And that's, if you look at that enhanced rover AI card at the top, you'll see there's a line at the bottom there that says tech plus yellow meeple plus, that's an AI symbol. That information was actually not for the players. That was for the facilitators to know, okay, this card has now been unlocked because they've done the correct research to identify it. Okay, so I mentioned dynamics in the previous slide. And so dynamics is really all about how does the game play out? And really dynamics are going to come in two flavors. There's going to be the planned dynamics, so the things that are playing out the way because you designed the game for them to play out that way. And then there's going to be emergent dynamics. And these are pesky things that happen all the time where players take your game and they do something that you did not want them to do or expect them to do. And so they can be good and they can be bad. Planned dynamics are actually kind of important for any sort of educational or cultural change game because you really want them to experience things in a certain way. You're trying to create a certain type of experience, and that is going to happen through those dynamics. So an example of a planned dynamic in the Mars Agency game was that we gave the director all of the cards at the beginning of the game. So these are all the cards that they know about, all the technologies, facilities, policies that they can choose to implement. We just gave them a huge hand of cards, and it was overwhelming. And so most people kind of got those cards and they were like, oh my gosh, this is so many cards. I'm immediately shutting down. I can't play this game, it's too hard. And this was done intentionally though, because one of our learning objectives was to teach leaders about the importance of delegating responsibility to the appropriate levels and not trying to just do everything yourself. And so this really kind of helped us drill that point across. It's like, okay, director, the problem is you're looking at this huge hand of cards and you're saying, how do I do all this myself? Don't do it all yourself. So in order for the director to be successful, what they need to do is they need to take those cards and start kind of chunking them up and handing them out to deputies that they think would be a good match. So for instance, there's an engineering deputy. And so maybe you take all those gray cards, which are facility cards, and you hand them to your engineering deputy and you say, hey, I want you to be responsible for making sure we're building the right buildings and we're maintaining the right buildings. Like that's going to be your responsibility instead of that one person trying to hold all that responsibility themselves. So that's an example of how we've defined the mechanics in the game in such a way to drive dynamics to help us kind of get our point across and why that learning objective is important. Now, an example of an emergent dynamic. So like I said, sometimes they're bad, and in those cases, if they're actually not helping you, if they're going against your learning objectives, then you're going to have to make a change in your rules or your mechanics to prevent it from happening. But sometimes emergent behavior is actually really interesting. So this is an example where in the game design, we actually had these screens. And so in that top image, you can see there's a play screen that's in front of a player setup. And this was done so that everyone can't just see all of the resources and how all of the people are assigned. This is kind of to emulate the unnatural kind of boundaries that exist between departments, right? So like the hydration department knows how the hydration guys are assigned. They know how much water we have. They're responsible for knowing how much we can produce. Do we have enough to last a month? So they're responsible for all that information. We wanted them to figure out good ways of sharing that knowledge amongst the team. But a number of players kind of came back and said, well, if we want to improve knowledge sharing, why don't we just remove these screens? And so that was not something that was built into the mechanics, but it happened in the game. We looked at it and we said, hey, you know what? That's a great example of agile organization behavior. So instead of like being worried about it, we're just like, yeah, sure, go ahead, remove the screens. That we're going to reward you for really kind of doing the takeaway of that objective and understanding what that's all about. And it made it a little bit easier for them to play. So again, sometimes emergent dynamics are dangerous. You need to change them. Sometimes they're just kind of neutral. They don't matter. And in rare cases, they actually help you with your learning objectives.
Peter,
Yep.
Alicia has a question. Given the vid, are you guys going to make an online version?
Yeah, so I think Sarah's going to talk about that a little bit later. All right, so and certainly, as anyone has questions, feel free to chime in. I can't see them, so if you can share them, that would be great.
And we have about 15 minutes left.
Okay. All right, so you do want to think about player goals. Goals are not the same as purpose, so this is something that you really want to consider. The purpose, your purpose, our purpose in the Marge Agency game was to teach people about organizational agility. They might have come to the game because they want to learn about organizational agility, but that's not the purpose in the game. You need to have goals in the game, and you need to have both narrative and mechanical goals. So we mentioned this earlier. Narrative goal is you're trying to prepare Mars for a new onslaught of workers that are going to be coming up, and mechanically, you're going to have to build biodomes and keep your workers alive. Additionally, you want to think about choice in games. So if you don't have any choice in a game, you're basically playing Candyland, right? That's a game that has no choice, and it's not much of a game. Unless you're a small child. So choice is really important. It's especially important in serious gaming because if we're trying to teach people something, we really want them to be engaged and to stimulate their minds, right? That's the whole reason we're using a serious game, is so that we can keep them engaged and keep their minds stimulated. And so if they don't have choices, then they might as well just be watching a PowerPoint. Narrative choices can kind of change the tone or atmosphere of a game, but most choices are really just going to be driving the dynamics and how the game plays off. And you really want to make sure that your trade-offs are well balanced. If you have one option that's just obviously a better choice, then you're not really providing a choice. Similarly, if all choices lead to the same horrible ending, you're not really providing a choice. In some cases, we need to do that because we're trying to kind of control the narrative in the game and control the experience, but you don't want it to be obvious, like it is for this poor cow here. In testing, I just wanted to mention real quickly, we do go through alpha, beta, and going gold. When you're doing alpha testing, at MITRE, we're usually kind of working mostly within the team. You can kind of test out mechanics, but you can't do more than a loose gut check against dynamics and whether or not you're achieving your purpose. When you get to beta testing, you're going to be bringing in representative players. This is when you can really kind of test out the dynamics of your game and see if you're achieving your purpose. And speaking of which, you do want to continually throughout this process of refinement, you do want to continually do these gut checks, and you want to be checking against, are you achieving your purpose? That's the number one thing, right? Are we actually achieving our purpose? Are we getting skill and knowledge transfer that we want? Are people coming away from the game learning the things that we want them to learn? And also, are they not getting negative learning, right? So that's a real danger, is that you can teach them negative behaviors, right? So they make bad habits or behaviors because of something you did in the game, and you definitely don't want that to happen. And are they having fun, right? If your players look like this, then you probably need to make some changes. All right, so in every single game what we go through, we each learn something, and so Sarah and I are each going to talk to you a little bit about our individual lessons learned from the process.
So the big thing here is that we wanted we knew that we wanted to keep people in the learning zone, but I think it was in the alpha testing, that really came out. So in that kind of reducing simplification process that Pete was talking about, initially there was so much complexity to the game. We had some people who exited the learning zone, went into the panic zone, and we had one participant who just got up and left in the middle of the beginning of the game because it was just too much. So that goes to the next bullet, is keep it simple. Really think about what it is you want them to take away and keep it simple. You just have enough there that allows them to access that learning. Setting clear expectations and continuing to repeat instructions was something else that we found was really helpful with this, especially because there was so much novelty and nuance to some of the mechanics. Pete?
So another, and I noticed I think I left Sarah on the whole time. Sorry about that, Sarah. Another thing that we were dealing with was the communication mechanics. So for agile organizations, communication culture is actually important. It was one of our learning objectives. We wanted to teach them about the impacts of your communication culture. And so we started them off with a really horrible communication culture in order to kind of show them why that's bad. And they had to basically communicate by writing down information on 3x5 cards, spending a time unit to actually send it back and forth. And so this, we prevented them from doing free and open communication. And so this was okay for kind of teaching that particular lesson, but it really hurt from just the perspective of why we're doing a tabletop in the first place. So one of the huge benefits of a tabletop are those kind of social interactions that you're having. And players can learn from each other, just kind of the questions that they're asking, or even just kind of the lessons that they learned that they're sharing across the table. So it wasn't something we wanted to have throughout the whole game. And so what we ended up doing is we did basically in the tutorial for the game, we start them off with those communication mechanics, have them kind of learn that lesson through the tutorial. And then at the end of the tutorial, we had them play this new policy called daily stand-ups, which basically broke that mechanic and allowed them to talk freely across the table. So that allowed us to still do that mechanic, but then allow for the open and free communication for the majority of the game. And I think the main takeaway here is just you want to be really careful about restricting any sort of communication when you're doing a tabletop game. Another thing that we found out is that screens are small. So these are the largest screens that our manufacturer could provide us with. And you can see we had 2 screens for facilitators, and it was really not enough. So we've actually got the box cover up there in between to help us expand the screen space. So it's just something to be aware of. If you have a lot of information you're trying to hide for, like the facilitator, for instance, it can be difficult.
So this is maybe not an answer to your question, Alicia, but we are talking about, how could we put this into an online or digital format? Tabletop was great when we could all be in person, but now that we are in our telework conditions, it would be really great to have a digital version. And I think we'd like to maintain the interactive piece of it. So maybe, people playing over Zoom or something like that. I'm not really sure what that would look like. So one of the other things that was important as we played the game is that the time that it takes to get through the game and get through the debrief is about 4 hours. And so throughout the gameplay, we would interweave debrief opportunities. In this picture, you can see Pete standing in front of our debrief board. And that was really there to help our players kind of track their progress. What are all the things that are going on in the environment? And then how are they doing on those dimensions that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation? And then how is that helping them or not get to the outcomes that they want to achieve? And so interspersing those and giving people, kind of forcing them into that reflection really enabled them to start to make the transfer of what's going on in the game to how might these agility principles play out in real life. And the next slide is just a close-up of that debrief board. So.
Okay. At this point, we do have some pictures. I'm just gonna share with you. Hopefully I'm sharing my screen, or do I have you on, Sarah?
But I can see your video, Pete.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So this is the final version of the boxed final version of the game. You can see not for play by 3-year-olds and under. Let me go ahead and pop the screen back up. So our plan was to actually let you guys kind of come up and touch and feel and play with the parts. It obviously doesn't work so well when we're all remote. So we have some pictures of the player setups just for you to be able to see. At this point, I think, fairly open, so definitely if people have questions, feel free to ask, but I'll just kind of talk about some of the pieces. So on the left here, we actually have the setup for the hydration department. You can see this is what most of the departments look like, and so they have basically that set of resources, the water resources that they're managing. They have some facilities that they're managing. They have their people. There's a curveball deck that's individualized for each player. On the right side, and maybe just you can see this is for the medical department. So they're a little bit different. They didn't actually maintain a set of resources. Their responsibility was for keeping all the workers healthy. And so they had some facilities that they were running. There was a clinic where sick workers went, and then they were rolling that die every turn based off of their own worker assignments to try to see if they were healthy. And they have their own curveball deck. And I don't know if you can see it too well, but at the very top right corner of our curveball decks, we actually had them numbered. That's because we were stacking the decks. Again, that goes back to we were trying to create a very specific experience. By stacking the decks, we could do that. We actually had more curveballs that we created than we actually stacked the decks with, and that allowed the facilitator to edit the the experience to whatever they felt like they needed for their particular group of people they were working with, modify that experience. And most players actually didn't even notice the number, which I was surprised about. So a lot of them didn't know that we had stacked the decks. Here's a few of the other components. I showed you the box earlier. We had a facilitator guide, some examples of the curveballs and scenarios, the two-sided cards there. There's a create team was a policy. Those were colored differently depending on what type of policy they were. And then the nanite engineering is an example of a technology that they could research. And then some of the other game components, those are the screens on the far right. So you can see we were trying to kind of actually use the screens to help build that environment for them. So as they looked around the table, this was kind of helping build the landscape, right? So they would see the back of everyone else's screen, and they would see that kind of that mountainous red desert area, which we imagined is what Mars might look like. And then on the front side of that screen, you've got information that kind of helps the players understand, what if they need a reference for the various different game components, or if they need to understand, at the very bottom, that weekly schedule kind of shows them the steps of a round. And then the board on the far left side, you can see that's the main game board. And that was two-sided. So if you did get that colonial burgeoning scenario that we mentioned earlier in the game, and again, we had more scenarios than were actually used in the game, so you could kind of modify the experience however the facilitator felt was appropriate. But if the colonial burgeoning one comes out, we would flip the board over because the goalpost has been moved and you need to build one more biodome. And this is just showing kind of the final game in action. You can see it takes up a lot of space. So you need a good amount of table space to play it. You can also see if you look way, way down at the end of the table near the facilitator at the top left, you'll see that 51. So they've actually done the right actions in this game so that they actually have access to that information which is otherwise hidden. So Sarah, did you want to talk to this at all?
This is just the different tools that we have as we've kind of gone down this organizational agility journey. And the game is the most recent edition.
And that's pretty much what we have for you folks. Definitely happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Peter. This has been a wonderful presentation. Learned a lot. Looks like a great experience for people.